Everybody, this is
modified COVID restrictions, so we are asking that
this
everyone
is the
keep their masks
sentencing
on
hearing for
unless they're
Derek
speaking.
Chauvin,
Ask
right
for
here.
people who are speaking to come up to the lectern and use the microphones, and please remove your mask so that we can hear you clearly, and also to maintain the distances that we have set out in the courtroom. With that, we'll proceed first with the state. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
Your Honor, we have 4 victim impact statements. We will start with the 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd, who will present hers by video.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah. Would
We
you,
used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Aw. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they helped him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
All right, thank you, Gianna. I really appreciate you answering questions today.
From the nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. Just look.
Names.
Brandon Williams, BRANDON WILLIAMS.
You may proceed.
On Monday, May 25th, 2000, was murdered by Derek Chauvin in a malicious and insidious display of hate and abuse of power. Chauvin killed George. Not only did he kill George, but he also displayed a total lack of consideration for human life as he did so. You saw it, I saw it, and millions of people across the country and the globe witnessed the act of hate. A year and 1 month later, I stand here before you tasked with the duty of expressing how George's death has impacted me personally and the rest of our family. As I racked my brain and thought about what I could say today, I came to this conclusion. It is humanly impossible for me to stand here and convey or articulate the right words that would capture all that we are feeling. So please bear with me as I attempt the impossible. The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye. The heartbreak and hurt goes far beyond any number of tears we could ever cry. Words simply cannot express the pain, anguish, and suffering that our family and friends have endured since George's murder. It has been truly unimaginable. But not as nearly unimaginable as the defendant's decision to take the life of a human being with no regard for the effect it may have on others. Although Chauvin will be sentenced today and spend time in prison, he will have the luxury of seeing his family again, talking to them, and he will likely get to spend time with them upon his release. These are all luxuries that my young cousin Gianna was robbed of when Chauvin made the active decision to kill our father. There will be no more birthday parties, no graduations, holiday gatherings, or other family celebrations. The laughter, hugs, guidance, advice, sense of security, and those opportunities to simply say I love you are forever gone. They say time heals all, and while I generally believe that saying, it's challenging to do so given these unfathomable set of circumstances. Before I conclude, I must highlight a few things. George's murder, his trial, and everything in between has been tragic and devastating. Our family is forever broken. And one thing we cannot get back is George Floyd. It is the request of my family that the maximum penalty for the crime for which the defendant was convicted be imposed. On behalf of my family, friends, community, and supporters, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing this opportunity of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, just for the record, this wonderful lady standing here is a Hennepin County victim advocate.
Is that on roll as well known to the court?
Yes, thank you, Judge.
And so, Your Honor, we'll next hear from the brother of George Floyd, Mr. Terrence Floyd.
And Mr. Floyd, if you could state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes. Terrence Floyd. That's Terrence, Floyd, Floyd.
Go ahead.
I'm here representing my brother. I'm from New York. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was murdered, everyone knows, by Derek Chauvin. The facts of this case were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and 3 guilty verdicts have been rendered. This situation has really affected me and my family.
They had a close-knit family too. You could see it from all points.
Any family member
Christmas,
that
graduations,
has went through this,
birthdays.
we are part of a
you could
fraternity
see that.
of families, and
And they really did like their brother.
it's not one of those, fraternities that you enjoy. I just, over this last year and months, I actually talked to a few people, and I wanted to know from the man himself why. What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why, when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there? A month before my brother was murdered, I was on the phone with him, and we had a long conversation. And as I looked at the video of my niece, the last conversation me and my brother had was he wanted to have play dates. He wanted to plan play dates with Gianna and my daughter, and we started setting it up. That can't happen. And I have to, my daughter's still young, but I still have to explain to her, because this is history. This is a case everybody knows about. So she's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to explain that to her. And I think that's, to me, harder than even just standing here. That I have to talk to my daughter and tell her, you know, about her niece, about her uncle, about the situation. That's basically reliving it all over again, years down the line. I'm here on behalf of my family, on behalf of me and my family, we seek a maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrist. We've been through that already. In my community, in my culture, we've been through that already. Smacked on the wrist. No. Because if it was us, if the roles was reversed, there wouldn't be no case. It would have been open and shut. We'd have been under the jail for murdering somebody. So we asked for that same penalty for Derek Chauvin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, the final victim impact statement for the state will come from George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd.
He looks just like his brother. They're all
And sir, if you could begin by giving us your full name and
Hilonise, last name Floyd, Floyd.
and you may proceed.
Well, 1 year ago, May 25th, my brother George was murdered by Derek Chauvin and his co-defendants in broad daylight with a knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I was a trucker, and immediately my life changed forever. I began to speak to the world for George from the United Nations, Africa, Canada, Japan, and so many other countries. Every day, I have begged for justice to be served, reliving the execution of George, while others begged and pleaded for Officer Chauvin to simply just allow George to take a breath. I haven't had a real night's sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life over and over again.
wow.
Even saying they're going to kill me. Please, officer. Screaming for our mom. I have had to sit through each day of Officer Derek Chauvin's trial and watch the video of George dying for hours over and over again.
Wow.
For an entire year, I had to relive George being tortured to death every hour of the day, only taking naps and not knowing what a good night's sleep is anymore. I've been lifted every day, so Hill, I thank you for allowing me to share this today. George's life mattered. So my family and I, most of all, my niece, Gianna. My niece, Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. Daddy's our daughter's first love. He would never be able to walk Gianna down the aisle at her wedding, attend those magical moments of her life like a daddy-daughter dance, sweet 16 party, seeing her out for prom graduations, and she would never be able to have any personal memories with her father. With a smirk on his face and children present, Officer Chauvin used excessive force and acted against his training. Chauvin had no regards for human life, George's life. I stand before you today asking you to please help us find closure by giving Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, making sure he does his time consecutively without the possibilities of parole, probation, or getting out early for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank.
Jesus Christ, have mercy.
Thank you, Your Honor. Here today, of course, for sentencing, gives us an opportunity to speak about other matters that I think are involved in sentencing and where we are in the criminal justice system and the processing of this case. As a member of an elected office representing the people of the state of Minnesota, as well as people of the local community, I want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to really thank some of the police officers in the Minneapolis Police Department who, under great pressure, great stress, to some extent at peril to their occupations, what they've devoted their life to, stuck to their oath and their commitment as police officers to speak openly and honestly about policing and the training that is given and received by police officers. Those officers didn't hide behind a blue wall. They came forward, they told this court and those jurors what they knew about training and responsibility. And I think they deserve recognition and credit for that. I would also like to thank members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. You know, those agents get called in, great sacrifice to their personal lives. Whenever things happen, they go. They did that here, and under really extraordinary circumstances, completed a very professional and thorough investigation. Conducting interviews is hard enough, but conducting them in the atmosphere of the city following the murder of George Floyd was even more difficult. And they did so, I think, above and beyond the call of duty. And I want to thank them for doing that on behalf of the whole prosecution staff. I want to thank the family, the loved ones, the friends of George Floyd. They have been through so much more than families involved in murder cases. He's right. It's a fraternity you don't want to be part of. But they've been through so much more because of the pandemic and because of security, safety precautions that we've had to take. They have been through a lot. At a time when they try to grieve, like everybody does for the loss of someone, and I want to thank the court saw a testimony from Florence Floyd, Courtney Ross. These are people who are trying to deal with their loss, but they have to do it in a very public way and under very trying circumstances through no fault of their own. So I thank them. They have all been models of grace and understanding. And it's really remarkable, quite frankly. I'll, I think, come back to them again in a little bit. Your Honor, we have submitted a sentencing brief. I would incorporate that. I guess I would incorporate my comments today into that memo. But I do think there are things that I want to bring out today in my arguments. For hundreds of years, the court had discretion in sentencing. It was the trial court's decision on what a sentence should be. The recognition that the trial court sat through the trial, watched the evidence, saw how it affected people, informed the court's discretion. When the legislature passed the guidelines, in a legitimate attempt to try and even out sentences, they defined certain presumptive sentences, as we all know, for typical crimes. For each crime, the typical crime. But they did not remove discretion for sentencing judges. They recognized that nobody is better suited to decide whether this is the typical case represented by that guideline's presumptive sentence, or if there are reasons why this is worse than that. And the guideline still gives this court discretion when there are aggravating factors to give a more serious sentence than what the guidelines presumption calls for. And as you know, we are asking you to do that today. As this court found, there are 4 aggravating factors that we have identified that go beyond a list of just what those factors are. We have not just done our homework and found a list. The court made good findings, detailed findings about those factors, and we think they justify a greatly increased sentence. This is not the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Supreme Court in our state has said that, and very recently, even 1 aggravating factor is sufficient to go twice the top of the range. Here we have 4. The first one that the court found is an abusive position of trust and authority. And the court specifically found that when Mr. Chauvin was acting as a police officer, he had a position of trust and authority. That is certainly true. We trust police officers. We trust them when we need help. We call them for help. We trust that they're going to take care of the problems that they are assigned to deal with, right? We trust them. We also give them great authority. We give them great power. We give them power to use force that individuals would be prosecuted for using, right? We give them authority to arrest, to detain. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. So they're not sent out there by themselves to do this. They're given substantial training. This court saw all of that through the trial, in general and in specific to Mr. Chauvin and the other 3 officers. They're given training on the use of force, the proportional use of force. The force used has to be warranted by the threat. They're given training on de-escalation because we recognize that police officers are called in when people are not having their best day, when people might be affected by mental illness, drug abuse, any number of issues. They're just having a bad day, and they're trained for that, and should be. And they're taught how to use that to de-escalate and control a situation. They're taught medical intervention. They're taught to provide medical attention to people who need it. Being a police officer is a difficult job. We ask a lot of them. It's a profession, there's no doubt about it. But we give them a substantial amount of training, and most officers do it right. This case wasn't about police officers, all police officers. It wasn't about policing. This case was about Derek Chauvin disregarding all that training he received and assaulting Mr. Floyd until he suffocated to death. One of the things that you heard, Your Honor, and the jurors heard that can really encapsulate, I think, a very important issue here. 7 words: in your custody is in your care. And it's a real simple mantra. It's a real easy thing to remember. You're going to take custody of somebody, you have to provide care. You have to do it in a caring way. You can't simply disregard their care. Mr. Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority as a police officer by doing just that, just disregarding all his training. It was an abuse of that because what did he decide to do? We often are forced in this, criminal justice system to infer people's state of mind by their conduct and their statements. What was Derek Chauvin's endgame here? What was the plan? It seems apparent the plan was hold him down until we can dump him in an ambulance and no longer have him be our problem. You recall he said to Charles McMillan, "He's a big guy, might be on something." That's it. He held Mr. Floyd down as Mr. Floyd begged for his life. He had the other officers help in that regard. And rather than doing the simple expedient of putting him on his side, he said, "Yeah, He was dismissive to that duty of care. We trust that arrestees will be treated with respect, reasonable force, and that their medical needs will be addressed." I'm paraphrasing from the court's findings. That trust was violated. We trust that they will use their authority reasonably, and this was a particularly egregious abuse of that force. Again, paraphrasing the court's findings. The typical second-degree murder does not involve that extent of abuse of a dearly held position of abuse, or a position of authority and trust by the community, by individuals of the community. Your Honor found that Mr. Floyd was treated by Mr. Chauvin with particular cruelty. I think tortured is the right word. We know that, we've all seen it. Mr. Floyd did not want to be in the back seat. That's it. That's the rub. It was the need to get him in that back seat no matter what. And we all saw that once he was pulled out of that back seat, he calmed right down, even willingly went down to the ground. "I'm going down," he said. And he went down to the ground, not fighting, not punching, and he was placed initially on his side. He's already handcuffed. He's placed on his side in a recovery position, like he should be, because he's trying to breathe, and then quickly placed prone on the ground, face down. Mr. Chauvin put his left knee on George Floyd's neck, his right knee on George Floyd's back, face down on the pavement. Had Officer King sit on Mr. Floyd's waist area, and had Officer Lane hold his feet down. You can even see Mr. Floyd trying to pull his feet up. We all are going to fight to breathe. Everybody knows that fear when you all of a sudden realize you're having trouble breathing. It's just innate, right? We want to survive. We know we have to breathe. And there's an automatic reaction when you begin to feel like that is threatened. And you can see Mr. Floyd going through that. He tries to pull his feet up. But he's held down by these 3 officers while Officer Tao is looking at. Later, of course, goes to keep the people who want to help away. On his pavement so harshly that it rubs the skin off his face. He has injuries to his face from being face down on the pavement. He has injuries to his knuckles from just trying to lift himself up. And he's telling Officer Chauvin, "I can't breathe. I'm dying." And Mr. Chauvin's response was, And all this time, I mean, imagine what Mr. Floyd is going through. For him to talk about particular cruelty and torture, really try to appreciate what he's going through. He knows he's suffocated. We don't know that feeling of not being able to breathe enough. He's begging, he's pleading, and he's being ignored. His concerns are being dismissed by somebody who has taken custody but not care. He was kept in that prone position for 9.5 minutes and was suffocated. There's no other way to say it. That's particularly cruel. That is more cruel than a typical second-degree unintentional murder. Significantly more. This is not a momentary gunshot, punch to the face. This is 9.5 minutes of cruelty to a man who was helpless and just begging for his life. This court found that there were children present, standing only a few feet from these officers. These children, who were ages 17 and one child age 9. Why is that an aggravating factor? Well, I think everybody can figure that out. Right? It's particularly bad to commit a crime in front of children. We've heard a lot of academia about the development of the young brain and how long it can take. And here you got a couple of teenage girls and a 9-year-old girl. How are they going to process this? Standing feet from a man being suffocated by police officers. Such a stark sight that one of the children even says, "We got to call the police on the police." How do you process that as a 9-year-old? The children were not only present watching a man die. We've all seen, if you haven't, you really need to. Look at George Floyd's face as he's dying. He's suffering. The children have to watch this. But not only that, police officers, and there are people around them wanting to help. And at one point, and sure, they got upset. At one point, Mr. Chauvin points his mace, grabs his mace to keep him back. How does a child look at that? There's another officer screaming at them to get back. A typical second-degree unintentional murder doesn't involve children standing feet away watching a 9.5 minute suffocation of a man begging for his life. This court also made a finding that the defendant committed the offense with the involvement of 3 or more other persons. Lane and King were involved directly in the restraint, and that Tao kept the bystanders at bay. I've already talked a little bit about Lane and King's role in holding Mr. Floyd down. They recognized that he was pulseless, and Mr. Floyd was pulseless at one point, and yet really made no effort to take care of the person in their custody. Officer Tao watched most of the suffocation, and then only went over to keep people from giving help. One person who is identified as a medical trained firefighter for the city of Minneapolis, and that was dismissed. Like, are we going to believe her? So they kept trained medical people from providing help. These were all uniformed peace officers, adding to that abuse of trust and authority. I know the defense has asked the court for probation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that. The realm of, I think, real possibility. This is a murder. I understand some of the arguments made on behalf of Mr. Chauvin. I understand, well, no, I can't understand what his family members and friends are going through. I can't. But it's certainly not enough for a departure to probation for a second-degree murder. We believe, Your Honor, that these 4 aggravating factors, the court and the findings that the court has made, certainly justify an upward departure because there are 4 of them, not standing alone, but in a sense, not overlapping, but coming together to show this is not the typical second-degree murder. This is egregious. And this justifies a double upward departure. From the top of the box, which is 180 months, we're asking the court to do a double departure, recognizing all 4 factors, to 360 months. As I mentioned before, Your Honor, this is sentencing. This is the time for victims, right? This is the time for the loved ones of the victim and the community to have a say. Again, I commend this family. I commend all of the loved ones, the friends, the people that have been involved in this case for tolerating and being gracious. None of this, of course, can bring George Floyd back. That's very true. But this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. This is the time for their criminal justice system to say, we recognize that this harm you're going through is real, and while we can't feel what you're feeling, we know we can do what your criminal justice system should do and recognize the severity of this crime and reflect that in the sentence to be given. It's time for this criminal justice system to say, we recognize this is more serious than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The 4 reasons the court found reflect that and give this court more than adequate basis to do that. Your Honor, we ask the court to impose a sentence of 360 months commended to the Commissioner of Corrections. As you know, Your Honor, there are no fines in murder cases. And we would ask the court just to reserve the issue of restitution. We can clarify that with the family and present that to the court for 30 days. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state?
Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. Mr. Blackwell?
I'm sorry, I just, thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, the defendant's mother, Carolyn Palenti, would like to address the court.
They're asking for.
If you could state your full name, spelling each of your names, and proceed when you're ready.
Carolyn, Carolyn, Palenti, Pawlenty. I am the mother of Derek Chauvin. I am here to speak on behalf of my entire family. On November 25th, 2020, not only did Derek's life change forever, but so did mine and my family's. Derek devoted 19 years of his life to the Minneapolis Police Department. It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth. My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man. Life and time to the police department, even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will
That's
never
That's his
know
mom.
That's his
the
mother.
loving and caring man he is
They didn't
that
raise
his
him right.
family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. I will not be able to see Derek, talk to him on the phone, or give him our special hug. Plus the fact that when he is released, his father and I most likely will not be here. Derek, my happiest moment is when I gave birth to you. And my second is when I was honored to pin your police badge on you. I remember you whispering to me, "Don't stick me with it." Derek, I want you to know I have always believed in your innocence, and I will never waver from that. I have read numerous letters from people around the world that also believe in your innocence. No matter where you go, where you are, I will always be there to visit you. I promise you I will stay strong, as we talked about, and I want you to do the same for me. I will do what you told me to do, take care of myself, so I will be here for you when you come home. Remember, there is no stronger bond or love than a mother's love. One final thought I want you to remember. Remember, you are my favorite son. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson.
It's the first time I've seen him change his position.
You mean the Sheriff Sherman?
Yeah.
I think he was traumatized. You know,
Thank you very much,
secretly,
Your
I've
Honor.
always thought that something happened to him,
It is my
that he
intent
didn't get
that
off
my
of that
remarks
boy's
this
neck,
afternoon be
and it was
quite brief.
mental. And I don't
I
believe
do
he
not
intentionally
intend to
killed that man.
relitigate the facts
That's
of this
my
case,
belief.
nor
But I
spend any
think when it
substantial
happened
There's
time
a
in
big
this-
black man who could take it. That's the
Looking at
problem.
the
Part of
law.
the problem. They think that we're indestructible.
Mm-hmm.
He's
The
used
court
to
is
it.
very
You don't know
familiar
who else he's
with the
done that
facts
to.
of this case,
Who's dead.
and the parties
May
are
not
fully
be the only
briefed.
one.
So
the court,
one of the things about
relevant
this
to the
trial
sentencing factors.
is it shows a lot of other police officers what they need to
And
be
we
doing.
recognize that in any
To me,
case,
and
any
if
sentencing that
he
comes
gives him
before
the
the
sentence
court,
he's supposed to
the court
have,
is tasked with a
that's all.
difficult job.
This
Court
guy
must
here
craft a
ran
sentence
into
that
all of
serves
the
the
shit
interests
that
of
all the
justice,
other police
a rather
officers have done.
nebulous term.
He's paying for it,
The
right?
court must take into consideration the victim impact, public interest, as well as the circumstances and the history of the defendant. And in this case, more than any of us have ever been, is exceedingly more difficult. In my remarks today, I just wish to briefly address each of those three considerations, starting with the public impact. As I believe we are all cognizant of, this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. We tried to keep a lot of that out of the courtroom during the trial, and make this case about the facts. But we recognize what has happened as a result of this case. There are a great number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as overly lenient and insufficient to satisfy justice. But there are an equal number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as draconian or overbearing. Either way, some percentage of the public will view your sentence as a miscarriage of justice. The intensity of the public interest in this case cannot be understated. I trust that the volume of correspondence that each of us has received from the public at large is indicative of these very sentiments on both sides. As I was informed just yesterday, the Attorney General's office established a web submission to accept community impact statements. Again, in my understanding is in a little over 2 weeks, they received over 1,000 submissions. Again, on both sides. By my very best estimate, since my representation of Mr. Chauvin began last summer, I would estimate that I have received over 5,000 emails, over 1,000 voicemails, and hundreds of handwritten letters.
So you got a racist country.
From both sides. And I expect that Your Honor has likewise been inundated with public comment and scrutiny. The impact that this case has had on this community is profound. It goes far beyond what happened on May 25th of last year. It has been at the forefront of our national consciousness, and it has weaved its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from the entertainment that we consume to the presidential politics, from protests to conspiracy theories. In the end, it is my sincere hope that when this proverbial dust settles, the community impact brings forth principled debate and civil public discourse, and ultimately leaves a positive effect on the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. But nevertheless, while this court may consider the community impact, it is for these very same reasons that the court must turn to the foundational legal principles and remember that justice is blind. Law is built on reason and common sense, and it cannot be permitted to be assailed by public opinion. Turning to the second consideration, which is the victim impact, the death of George Floyd. The death of George Floyd was tragic. He is loved by his family members. He is loved by his friends. And his death is justifiably mourned by those whose lives he impacted. He is a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a friend of many. And as the court heard today, the impact and the loss of his life, simply just can't be simplified. And it will take time. Finally, Your Honor, the court must take into consideration, just like it has to take into consideration the aggravating factors, it needs to take into consideration the mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors as set forth by the sentencing guidelines really point to the TROG analysis, essentially, ultimately in this case. We're not going to spend a lot of time, again, arguing for a probationary sentence. That's briefed. But that being said, when we look at the TROG factors, 19 years as a Minneapolis police officer. I was contacted during the course of my representation and have had numerous conversations with his fellow police officers or fellow police officers that worked with Derek, some retired, some still active. And they told me that he was a solid police officer, that he did his job
that if somebody asked him to do a particular task, he never complained, he did it. One person told me that one of his sergeants told me that if I had asked him to dig a ditch for 8 hours, he would have picked up a shovel and he would have never complained for a second. He would have done his job. He was decorated as a police officer. Multiple life-saving awards. He was decorated for valor. He was proud to be a police officer because what he liked to do was help people. And as the statistics show, the vast majority of police work is helping people. He was proud to be a Minneapolis police officer. He served his country as the United States in the United States Army. And he too is a son, and a brother, and a father, and a friend. He too, his life, the life he's lived, he's not coming into this as a career criminal with 6 points, 5 points, 4 points. He's coming into this never having violated the law because he lived an honorable life and he attempted to live an honorable life. Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time. I know from numerous conversations that I've had with Derek that his brain is littered with what ifs. What if I just had not agreed to go in that day? What if things had gone differently? What if I never responded to that call? What if, what if, what if? The truth of the matter is, and the end result is that we are here after a jury verdict, finding him guilty of these offenses. And the court's consideration should not only be focused on the aggravating factors, but the mitigating factors as well. The Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission was established for a reason. And yes, the court in circumstances like these has discretion to go beyond and aggravate a sentence beyond the presumptive sentences established by the sentencing guidelines. But the sentencing guidelines don't differentiate between second-degree murders. Someone robs a liquor store, a police officer is involved in an incident, and a person dies in police custody. The law presumes, the legislature presumes, that the sentencing guidelines as established is a sufficient penalty for all of the second-degree murder categories, or cases you would say. From 2019 back to 2010, a total of 90 people were sentenced for second-degree murder. Those sentences, those people, there were more than that, but people who had a 0 criminal history score, more than 90 people were sentenced. 67%, or 60 of those 90 people, received a guideline sentence of 150 months. So 2/3 of all people in this same position received a guideline sentence. 20% received an aggravated sentence, 18 of the 90, and 13% or 12 individuals were granted mitigated departures. So if the legislature and the intent of the sentencing guidelines is to eliminate sentencing disparity, the law should presume that the guideline sentence is what is appropriate in this case. Judge may take into consideration at this have to with the mayor. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult case for the Floyd family to have to endure. The state of Minnesota, likewise, the prosecutors in this case have endured quite a bit, as has Mr. Chauvin's family. This is a case that has changed the world to some degree. And I hope it's positive. But it's my hope that the court follows the sentencing guidelines, applies the law in a reasoned manner, and imposes a just sentence.
Thanks, Mr. Chauvin. Would you join Mr. Nelson at the lectern? Mr. Chauvin, this is your opportunity if you wish to give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thanks, John.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
What did he mean by that?
Well, more than likely, they may have found that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eamon Mohideen in New York. We are continuing our breaking news coverage of the sentencing hearing there for Derek Chauvin. It is in a 15-minute recess after nearly an hour of testimony. That included members of George Floyd's family, as well as, for the first time, hearing
it was almost like he was giving a warning, like, hey, you know,
and at the very end, as you heard there,
my condolences, but I'm not going to be in here for as long as you think.
In that 15-minute recess, the sentencing hearing for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin convicted in the murder of George Floyd. Now, outside the courthouse, there has been a growing number of supporters there watching this sentence hearing unfold, listening to it on their phones, sometimes reacting to the words as they were being played out. Chauvin faces up to 40 years in jail for George Floyd. The prosecution 160 months, that would be 30 years for kneeling on George Floyd's neck for a total of 9.5 minutes. Now, the specific charges are second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Of course, the murder was captured in a deeply disturbing video, igniting a reckoning on racial disparities in America and fueling calls for police reforms. We saw protests all around the world, as we mentioned. We heard from 4 of George Floyd's family members, including his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna.
They actually murdered this guy here in Georgia, and they didn't even get sent to that guy.
And offered an emotional testimony on what George Floyd's loss
was on
meant for them as a family. Take a look.
Right. So that's what I'm saying.
Birthday parties. No
This
graduations,
case,
holiday
good
gatherings,
Lord,
or
has
other
something
family
to do with it.
celebrations.
Because, like,
The
you
laughter,
never seen it
hugs,
all
guidance,
overseas and
advice,
everywhere, and then
sense
all
of
these
security,
laws
those
have been changed
opportunities
because of
to
this
simply
man.
say, "I love
Because of
you,"
that video.
are forever gone.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. You don't see. He may have. I mean, even if he didn't, I know there are other officers around the country who did something to somebody, and they're
they
dead.
have videos too. Remember that?
Well, but I'm saying, and they're dead without video. So, because for most of my life there hasn't been video. Yours too. Video's a new
When
thing.
they had videos
But
of
Ma,
this stuff
they
here.
didn't. My point is, they didn't have videos 10 years ago. And yet there's still police officers.
Now,
They didn't have
Chauvin, as we
videos.
mentioned, and as you
That's what I'm
probably
saying,
saw
that
there,
you don't know how many black men were killed.
His hearing, his remarks
And
will be
guess
considered
what?
as evidence in
He's
future
gonna take a lot of
appearances,
that.
and in his
That's
appeal
what I
of
was
this
saying. This
conviction.
case, they
But
made
his
an
mother
example out
did
of this
speak
case.
on his behalf.
The people that protested.
Derek has played
This
over
guy
and
had the
over
best
in
lawyer I'd ever seen.
the events of that day.
So, and then for a family to get $27 million.
Video.
lengthy
That
sentence will not
video
serve
and that
Derek
girl.
well.
That girl could have done what a
When
lot
you
of people
sentence
do.
my son,
Even some people that, like I've noticed,
also be
and I'll say the video
sentencing
people
me.
have made And I'll say, how come you didn't keep it trained?
Coverage of all this on the ground,
But
as
that
well
didn't
as Reverend Al
phase her.
Sharpton,
She
joins us
kept
now
it
from
right
the
on there.
Sharpton Network and host of Politics Nation.
Yeah,
Right
like
now
that
on
video.
MSNBC.
I'm
He
saying
was
without
inside
her
that
video,
courtroom
none of
throughout
this
that
happens.
sentencing hearing.
None
Rev,
of
let's
it.
just get a
None
quick
of it.
update from
None of
you
it.
as someone who
Because
witnessed that
people
hearing.
you can say
the
things till the
emotion
cows
that
come
we saw
home,
play out both
but
from George
video
Floyd's
is
family
powerful.
and others in
It's
the courtroom.
powerful,
What
and
did
it
you
also
see?
has to do with who's doing the video and who's explaining it and all.
No, she didn't have to explain it. She just pointed it.
That
She's 17 years old. No, it didn't. That video, you know, between the time that video, between the time that
I'm not
video,
talking about it anymore.
between the time that
We
video
don't
came
have to lose
up,
friendship over it. You got your idea about it, and I have mine. So I don't want to talk about it anymore.
I'm just gonna say that between the time the video came out and I heard about it was less than a day.
The sentencing
It went around that
someone
fast.
that has now been convicted.
It was that
It's something that
explosive. It
has
was
all
that
kinds of national
it was that
global
that was a
ramifications. But to be here with the family,
that was a
they talk
video.
about their
You're
brother,
right
they
about
talk
that
That's all I'm
part.
saying.
their
But
uncle,
all I said to you
and they're
is you have to
talking
give
about
credit
will
to the
his
people that
life
handled it.
and the way he was killed be weighed before this judge.
That was
This
a
judge
powerful
can't
video.
either
You are totally correct.
uphold the
One of the most powerful
conviction
ones I've
that
ever
this
seen,
jury
but you
came
couldn't look
to,
at it.
or he can undermine it and undercut it. But
I've never seen anything like it. It's not one of the most, it's the most. I've never seen anything like it.
that was
That's
found
what
by
I'm
this
saying.
jury.
Nothing.
So I think
And
that
if
they
you
are
dwell on it, you couldn't sleep.
clearly
For somebody
emotional
to stay
and
on
clearly
something
hoping
and
that this
somebody's
chapter,
neck and
this
have a
part
person
of-
pleading for their
of
life and you
what
still
they're
kill
going
them.
through is with justice.
And the world sees
Clearly,
that. And that's the
other,
power of, see, that's the
federal
power of the
charges,
internet.
That's
as well
why
as
it was
the drive
all
for the
overseas.
US Senate
That's
to
why it
pass
was
the
And in
George
seconds,
Floyd
I saw it.
Justice
I got a
Act
text.
is the
It
next
was on
chapter.
here. It was every
They're gonna
place.
leave it
It was on
determined
Twitter
either
before it
way
hit television.
that the Senate do what
And
these
It was on
juries do,
Instagram. It was
and
like,
that is
phew,
find that the
you
life
know.
of the
Yeah.
George Floyds of this country
That's
matter.
true.
Rev, can I just get your reaction to something that the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin said, which I thought was interesting only in the context because he said that because of the significance of this case, because of the way this case has now affected everything we consume from entertainment all the way to presidential politics, that regardless of what happens, the sentencing will be viewed by some as a miscarriage of injustice. And I wanted you to respond to that. Is there a threshold where the family would feel this is justice, that anything below that is injustice?
Well,
The
sure.
family has said that they want to see the maximum case. They said it both in advance of the case. They've said it once there was a conviction. They said it today to the judge. And I think that they would want to see the maximum. Clearly, anything beneath what even the state laws of Minnesota would say, given that he was convicted of murder 2 and murder 3 and manslaughter, would be not only insulting,
Just think
but it
about
would
if they
add
had
to the
videos of
danger
them people
of
having
police
dinner and
feeling that they
watching
would not
the
be
Black
held
Lives Matter.
accountable. But
Just
this
think about that.
family, who has
Just think
shown
about how
great
that would have
grace
affected our
and
black
great
kids.
restraint throughout these last few months, has only asked for justice. And I think what is important here, Eamon, is to remember that not only has the public felt this, as you said, the defense attorney raised the point that some will always see it as an injustice. The jury found him guilty. He was judged by a jury of his peers that said he was guilty of murder. The judge ought to answer the charge the jury has convicted him of.
Rev, I want you to stay with me for a moment. If you have to go for any reason, I completely understand that, but I do want to bring into the conversation Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney, senior FBI official, and also an MSNBC contributor. Chuck, great to have you with us. I wanted to talk to you about the 4 aggravating factors that were outlined there, because as I understood it from just watching that hearing and reading in on this, there are the sentencing guidelines, there is the presumptive sentence, but the prosecution, here, both Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Frank, making the case that there were 4 aggravating circumstances that the court acknowledged that say they would take this sentencing beyond the presumptive that George Floyd was treated with particular cruelty, that Chauvin abused his authority and trust and power, and that the crime committed was done so among a group of officers, and more importantly, that the crime committed was done in front of children who witnessed this, and by extension, the community now has been traumatized. Is that a compelling case, legally speaking, to go beyond the presumptive sentencing?
It is, Eamon, and to understand it best, let me just give you some framework. Sentencing guidelines exist, I think, in every state and certainly in the federal system. And as you said, they set a presumptive sentence, right? A mid-range for the average case. What the prosecution argued here, and I think they're exactly right, is that this is not the average case. So if the average case of second-degree murder in the state of Minnesota for somebody who has no prior criminal record would be about 12 and a half, 13, 14 years, their argument is that this should be more. Because Derek Chauvin was an officer and abused the position of trust, because the crime was committed in front of children, because Derek Chauvin acted with particular cruelty, the average case, the midpoint case, they argue, doesn't suffice. And so here the judge has to determine whether or not those things happened, whether the prosecution is right, whether those are compelling arguments. He sat through the trial, he heard the evidence, and his ruling, as I understand it, is that there are aggravating circumstances here. To me, that suggests he's going to go above the midpoint. He may not go as high as the family wants, 40 years, which is the maximum. He may not go as high as the prosecution has asked for, 30 years. But I imagine he will go above the midpoint because this is not the ordinary case, and an enhancement is warranted.
Chuck, what did you make of Derek Chauvin's appeal here at the very end? And just from a legal perspective, is that something that the judge will take into consideration? He said that he's unable to give a full statement. He did offer condolences to the Floyd family, but then there was this interesting line at the end where he said there will be information in the future that may, quote, give you some peace of mind.
Yeah, I found that last statement both bizarre and unsatisfying, Eamon. I don't know what would give them peace of mind other than something that they cannot have, which is George Floyd back. And by the way, there's a big difference between condolences, which doesn't take very much to offer, and remorse, which does. Now, I understand that Derek Chauvin has other legal jeopardy, and I understand he may not want to say very much, but if your question to me is, would a judge find what he said compelling? I think not. He didn't express remorse. As a former federal prosecutor, I would like to have heard that. I'm not surprised that I didn't from this man.
All right, gentlemen, stay with me. I want to cross
That's what
outside
I'm saying.
to the
He used the time to basically say or imply, oh, by the way, there's something about your son that you may not like. And that's the way that I took it. I thought he should have just simply sent his condolences, apologized for what he did, and sat down. But he had to add something in that made him sound superior.
Some reaction to what was being said when we were hearing from Derek
the mother
Chauvin's
may
mother,
not
when we
even
were
know it. Some
hearing
people
from the
fucking
Floyd
don't
family.
know how they
You're
raise
there on
their
the
kids.
ground. Tell us what you saw and heard play out inside the courtroom compared to what you saw outside.
Good point that you made there, Eamon. If you were looking at that small box on the right hand of your screen, they were listening to a different feed than what we were playing. So they were about 30 seconds to a minute behind what you were actually listening to. So the timing was off a little bit, but let me give you an idea of just kind of where we are. The Hennepin County courthouse is right there. So this is a group of people who are right in front of the courthouse, and we'll go in a little bit to see what's there. You have about 100 or so people who were sitting around, who were glued to the hearing as it was happening. You see some of them still there now. There's a big boom box, essentially, that was playing out the feed of the hearing, of the sentencing. And one thing that you notice is how the mood shifted over the time. In the beginning, when you heard those victim impact statements, statements from George Floyd's daughter, from his brother, from his nephew, you heard people or you saw people rather, just really glued to their phones, looking down on their screens at times, really hanging on to every single word that was being spoken. Once you saw Eric Nelson take the stand, you saw people get a little bit more animated. There was some boos at some point. Sometimes people interrupted what was being said by chants of no justice, no peace. So you definitely saw a shift in tone as this was going through. But I think the bottom line that you see here is that people are paying attention to what's happening. And I've just been kind of walking around as this was happening and as that hearing was taking place, just asking people, what are you expecting? What do you want to hear from Judge Cahill when he gives his sentence? And it's a range of opinions. closely and know the sentencing guidelines, or at least more familiar with them, they say 20 years, 25 years. From a lot of people here who just know what they saw from the trial, who just know the headlines, they say they want a maximum sentence. And that is what you heard from the family when they made that plea to Judge Cahill. They want there to be some accountability. They want to see Derek Chauvin sentenced to a maximum sentence. And that's what is an expectation from many of the people here right outside the courthouse. Some people who aren't even from Minneapolis, who happen to be visiting here, heard the sentencing was happening and came down just to witness what they believe will be a moment. Amen.
All right, so I just want everyone to know that we are awaiting the return of Judge Peter Cahill. The sentencing hearing has taken a 15-minute recess. We're about 3 minutes out from the resumption of that hearing. If everything goes according to plan, we will expect the judge to come in and ultimately read his sentencing verdict after listening to impact statements both from George Floyd's family as well as from Derek Chauvin's mother, Derek Chauvin's attorney, and Derek Chauvin himself. I want to bring into the conversation right now Nakima Levy-Armstrong, a civil rights attorney and former president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and Cedric Alexander, former public safety director for DeKalb County, Georgia, past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, former member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and an MSNBC law enforcement analyst, excuse me. I'll start with you, Nakima, and just get your reaction to what you heard play out. Give me your overall takeaways in the minute or so that we have. What stood out to you?
Of course, the testimonials by the family members of George Floyd, including his young daughter. It was very sad watching the trauma unfold in the courtroom and just hearing George Floyd's daughter talk about missing her dad and how he helped her brush his teeth. That really struck me as a mother. I was most distressed listening to Carolyn Valenti, the mother of Derek Chauvin, essentially express absolutely no empathy for George Floyd or his family and being in denial about the heinous crime that her son, Derek Chauvin, committed against George Floyd.
Cedric, your reaction to what you saw today, both from a legal perspective, law enforcement perspective, and on a human level?
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, to be quite frank with you, what we saw is a trial that took place. And Mr. Derek Chauvin had a fair trial, and his peers were on those juries, and they reached a conclusion of guilty. And what we're going to see played out here today is a judge who's going to make a decision as it relates to what his penalty should be. To be perfectly honest with you, quite frankly, the courts did exactly what they were supposed to do. So there was a tragic loss of life that was conducted in a very heinous way, and I think most of us would agree with that. We saw witnesses, certainly the family of George Floyd, who would never see the return of their son and their brother and their father ever again. And whatever penalty is meted out here by this judge is going to be based on what the law is there in the state of Minnesota. So if we say that we are law and order types of people, then we've seen the law being executed, and we're going to see a sentence here pretty soon and see if it resonates with that or it resonates with that of the prosecution. But in all fairness, I think in objectivity to everyone, I think it's important to keep in mind in all of this is that there was a judicial process there in the state of Minnesota, in Hennepin County, that carried out its job. Everyone did their job. There was a conviction, and whatever the court penalty may happen to be, that's what we will all subsequently have to accept.
All right, you're looking at live pictures outside the Hennepin County Courthouse there in Minneapolis. It is 2:45 p.m. local time there. Any minute now, Judge Peter Cahill expected to return to that courtroom and give his sentence to Derek Chauvin for his involvement in the murder of George Floyd. Mr. Alexander, I do want to ask you about one of the aggravating factors that was cited there by the defense attorney, the prosecution, Matthew Frank, on behalf of the Floyd family, and that involved the presence of the other law enforcement officers. Why, from your perspective, that should push the sentence beyond the sentencing guidelines from the presumptive sentence?
Well, I think when we look at this in retrospect, there were 3 other officers on that scene who, quite frankly, could have taken some action to end that particular event from coming to the tragic end that it came to. And I think the fact that they did not, but of course they're going to have their own day in court and they're going to have to make their own defense. But I think when you look at that as an aggravating piece of all of this, it is not a good optic for that scene, and it certainly was not a good optic for the public safety community at large, because we all have a responsibility. If we see a fellow officer acting out in a way that is unbecoming, we have a responsibility. And it shouldn't have to just be a policy. It should be within you. It should be ethical, right? To you, say, hey, this has to stop. We're not going to do this.
And Nikita, I wanted to come back to a point that you raised, which also I thought was pretty interesting, which was Derek Chauvin's mother speaking, and not, at least from my watching that, and I could be wrong, but you tell me your opinion, not expressing any emotion to the Floyd family about their loss as well, in addition. And I'm wondering whether you noticed that as well. I know she defended her son, certainly emotionally, but it was also what she didn't say that I was wondering, could that have been a factor in presenting to the judge?
Well, I certainly think it was a factor in Derek Chauvin's upbringing. To have a mother realize the atrocities that have been committed by her son against George Floyd and many other people, to simply say that a long sentence will also be a sentence for her is absolutely absurd. And so it speaks to this notion of what is happening inside of white households when they have the opportunity to teach their children empathy, to teach them about racial justice, to teach them about compassion for other people. It was very distressing for me as a Black woman who lives in Minneapolis, who's been out on the front lines, to witness the statement by Carolyn Pawlenty. In terms of the question that you raised earlier about the aggravating circumstance involving 3 or more officers being present, I think that aggravating factor speaks to what some of us feel is a gang culture mentality that exists within far too many police departments, where you have a squad car that shows up on the scene, and maybe they are dealing with someone in a judicious manner. Suddenly, when multiple squad cars show up, there is more attention, and sometimes that leads to brutality on the parts of those officers. If we think back to what happened with Rodney King, very similar in terms of multiple officers kicking and beating a Black man lying in the prone position.
Yeah, and we should just note our viewers were about 4 minutes behind schedule here in terms of the return of Judge Peter Cahill to give that sentencing. We finally have now a live feed coming out of that courtroom. We'll keep an eye on it once the hearing resumes. We'll take you there live. Nikema, let's talk post-sentencing here, because the Floyd family talked about what justice means for them, but also the impact of this moment in our country and where we go forward. Reverend Al talked about that briefly. I want to get your thoughts. What does not just the immediate sentencing in terms of delivering justice to the Floyd family mean, but what is it going to take, and does this set a precedence, you think, for other cases of similar magnitude?
Well, I think that a sentence of 30 years or more would bring not a sense of justice. Justice would be getting George Floyd back, which can never happen at this point. But it would bring a sense of accountability. Derek Chauvin became the first white officer in the history of the state of Minnesota to even be convicted for killing a Black person. And so the fact that the jury came back with 3 guilty verdicts in that case, and now Derek Chauvin will be sentenced to prison, has already made history in a sense of message.
All right, Nikema, I apologize to interrupt. Let's go back into the hearing and listen to Judge Peter Cahill deliver his sentence.
I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation, all the facts of the case and the law, I'm actually going to be very brief because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determine the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever, because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury, finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 60904, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentence for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law.
Threw the book at him.
And you will
That's what he
receive
just
a copy
did.
of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded in custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything from the defense? All right, thank you. We are adjourned.
For those of you who are wondering what just happened,
Former Minneapolis Police Chief Derek Chauvin.
He's going to
sentenced
jail
270 months, according to Judge
a while.
Peter Cahill there inside the courtroom. You're just watching his sentence hearing. It has been adjourned. 270 months.
Plus,
by my count, 22
right.
and a half years
Yep,
with
22 and a half
199 days already served.
Right.
Quite a stunning moment there. Not what the family had asked for. They had asked for the maximum sentence of 360 months, which would have been 30 years. We're going to have reaction to all of that in just a moment. I do want to cross over now to Megan Fitzgerald in George Floyd Square for a reaction to how that played out. Megan.
so anyway, I felt that was just. He threw the book at him. You know, he said that it was Floyd there was an additional set of penalties put on there, but 22 years, that's a generation. He'll be in jail for a generation. So that's it. 22.5 years in jail. And but he did throw the book out because he gave him with the book prescribed. He said, there, boom. And he specifically, he said he wasn't trying to send a message, but he did send a message. What do you think, Mom?
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Be in jail 22 years and a half.
22 years.
22 years and 5 months.
22 years and 22 years and 6 months. 0.5 is.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
22 years.
In 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, subscribe to Zenny62. Bookmark OaklandNewsNow.com. We'll have more to say later. But that ends this broadcast.